complex crime. The incident that occurred in late summer 2016 at Spring Creek Park sparked a wave of public outrage. How many similar tragedies must happen before New York City authorities listen to the citizens' pleas? Local residents had repeatedly alerted authorities about the presence of unsettling individuals in the park. Some of them would gather in groups while others wandered alone. Either way, their appearance evoked a sense of danger. Regrettably, it took a crime for the city administration to finally take action and address this issue. Additionally, the event led to numerous discussions and topics about the safety of female runners, particularly those who exercise alone. According to a survey, 54% of women feel anxious when they go out, fearing they might be subjected to verbal harassment or physical attacks. The story of Karina Vetrano is both horrifying and baffling. Firstly, because nothing seemed amiss on the day of the fateful event. The attack on the woman occurred in broad daylight, in a fairly populated area. Secondly, her death has a mystical aspect to it. And thirdly, the investigation of the case, as well as the sentencing of the perpetrator, raised many questions. On Tuesday, August 2nd, 2016, Karina arranged to meet her father after work. They wanted to spend time together. Since Miss Vetrano had moved, family gatherings had become rare because everyone was busy with their own things. In addition, the young woman was combining two jobs. Philip picked up his daughter and took her to his home. There, the family shared their impressions of the past week. When Karina was about to go home, she asked her father if he wanted to go jogging with her, as they often did, covering several miles together. Her father replied that he couldn't this time. "You see, my back hurts so badly that nothing helps. Maybe a new prescription is needed. Or maybe it's the change in the weather," Mr. Vetrano explained. "Maybe I should call you a cab." The weather was beautiful, the heat had abated, and there was a fresh smell in the air. Therefore, Karina declined the offer. Besides, she was training for the upcoming marathon. The young woman had recently broken up with her boyfriend and wanted to distract herself. A jog would clearly do her good. That evening was the last time the parents saw their youngest daughter. At 5:45 p.m., she left the house for a jog. Her first stop was Spring Creek Park, a cozy, tranquil place, buried in greenery. A true paradise amongst the city's infrastructure. However, only part of the park was available for walking. The rest was covered with thickets and swamps. Mr. Vetrano asked his daughter to stick to her usual route, to stay away from unfamiliar paths and people. Unfortunately, Karina ignored his advice. In search of solitude, she decided to go to a grassy, deserted place. Karina's thoughts were abruptly interrupted. She felt a sharp pain in the back of her head, and she fell down. This rash decision cost the young woman her life. A frightening uncertainty entered the Vetrano home. It had been 2 hours since they had said goodbye to their youngest daughter. She should have been home by now, or at least answering the calls of her parents, who were frantically trying to reach her. And she had promised to keep her cell phone to herself. The anxiety was growing. Her father sensed that something was wrong and decided to seek help from his neighbor, the chief of the New York City Police Department. They were on good terms, and the high-ranking official knew that Philip would not make a fuss over nothing. After that, Karina Vetrano was reported missing. Police began searching for the young woman, combing the park area and surrounding streets. As a result, experienced canine units were brought in. As it is known, the first 24 hours after the disappearance of a person are crucial and most informative. Therefore, law enforcement utilized all available resources before nightfall. At the same time, Mr. Vetrano, along with a group of volunteers, searched for his daughter on his own. He scoured the park from end to end, combing the paths and wading through the tall grass, all the while making phone calls. As dusk fell, the man noticed a light in the grass. As he approached, he recognized Karina's phone. Maybe she lost her cell phone and just didn't let us know. Philip hoped. The patriarch of the family headed toward the police officers, deciding to pick his way through the thicket. Stepping into the grass, he came across something soft. A partially undressed female corpse lay face down. Philip turned it over and saw a familiar face. A desperate scream burst from his father's chest. It was Karina. She hadn't lost her phone like he thought. His little girl wasn't answering her phone because she had been robbed of her life. The realization of what had happened overwhelmed Mr. Vetrano. Hearing the screaming and yelling, the police rushed to him. They dragged Philippe away from his daughter's body, trying to explain that this was now a crime scene. Anything in the area was considered evidence. To prevent the evidence from being tampered with, the law enforcement officers asked the father of the deceased not to touch anything. On the way home, Mr. Vetrano thought a lot. He was tormented by how to tell his wife about their daughter's death. Images of the past flashed before his eyes. He remembered how on July 12, 1986, in Queens, their second daughter was born. Philip had been proud of her from an early age. She was obedient and well-mannered. He vividly remembered taking her to her first day of school, how well she did in her studies. Such education enabled her to earn a higher degree. Karina graduated from St. John's University with a master's degree in speech pathology. She had always dreamed of helping children and worked with autistic kids. His daughter was multifaceted. She loved to travel and write. She adored sports, especially running. Their shared passion brought them closer. She was his inspiration. The father remembered how jealously he treated her suitors. He so wanted her to be truly loved, hoping that she would eventually create a strong family like he and Kathy had, and give him wonderful grandchildren. The return journey turned into an eternity. At the entrance to the house, Mr. Vetrano paused, taking a deep breath. "I need to be strong to support my family. I have to pull myself together," the man commanded himself. His wife met him at the threshold. Fortunately, he didn't need to explain anything to her. She understood everything from her husband's face. Kathy cried, approached her husband, and hugged him. Soon, Karina's relatives and friends learned of the incident. They struggled to recover from the shock. Believing in the sudden death of the young woman was hard, let alone accepting its violent nature. Miss Vetrano had been subjected to a brutal attack. This was the conclusion reached by investigators. At first glance, it was obvious that the woman had resisted. Even in death, her fists remained clenched. Bruises and abrasions were found on her once young and healthy body, and her athletic clothing was torn. The autopsy showed that the back of the victim's skull had been damaged by a blunt object, probably a stone. However, the cause of death was asphyxiation. A clear mark was visible on the woman's neck. The forensic examination also revealed the intimate nature of the crime: violence. The experts' findings confirmed the police's initial suspicions. Earth and grass were found under the victim's fingernails, probably in an attempt to free herself from her attacker's grip and escape. Specialists examined her mouth and found her teeth knocked out and cracked in places. She had clearly bitten to defend herself. Even the woman's neck was covered with numerous scratches. She was grabbing with her hands, trying to force her attacker to let go of her. Karina did not want to die and fought hard for her life. Karina Vetrano's youngest daughter, Karina, had a variety of interests, but she especially loved writing. In 2013, she starred in a short movie by her friend and screenwriter Petros Georgiadis, which was based on a poem she had written, Paradox. In her blogs, the girl often addressed complex issues, often touching on the topics of love and the end of life. Shortly after this tragedy, new information was leaked to the media. In Princeton, Massachusetts, the body of another jogger was found among the tall grass. The woman, apparently also out for a walk in a secluded place, suffered a similar fate. At first glance, the cases were identical. Could there be another serial offender in America? The case was taken up by geneticists, who were tasked with comparing DNA samples collected from the crime scenes. As luck would have it, unidentified samples were found on both victims. Contrary to police expectations, the analysis revealed no connection between the crimes. It turned out that the DNA samples belonged to different people. Particularly intriguing is the story surrounding the DNA material taken from under her fingernails, on her back, and from Karina Vetrano's phone. The DNA was found in small quantities, but was deemed sufficient for analysis by experts. For a long time, this DNA remained the only lead in the investigation, giving a chance to identify the perpetrator. It is known that most life-ending crimes are committed by someone close to the victim, so the police could not dismiss any possibility. For this purpose, the victim's father provided his DNA as he was the one who first discovered his daughter's body. However, the timing for this procedure was poorly chosen. It took place on the day of Karina's funeral. Later, all of the woman's relatives also underwent a DNA test, which did not give any matches. Detectives decided to interview Karina's relatives and friends, finding out if Mrs. Vetrano had any enemies or ill-wishers. It turned out that there were none. Everyone respected and loved her. Then the investigators developed a new version. The deed was committed from base motives. Someone met the beautiful Karina in a secluded place and attacked her, giving in to base motives. At a loss, the investigation sought the public's help by offering a $10,000 reward for information that could lead to the perpetrator. The initiative received a widespread response. Detectives explored some 250 leads, conducted 600 genetic tests, and compiled more than 1,700 reports, all to no avail. It seemed that the perpetrator had not committed crimes before, at least not been caught for them, which further complicated the investigation. On August 31st, 2016, a utility worker approached the police station with some information. At the time of Miss Vetrano's death, he was in a restricted area of the park and saw a man emerge from the bushes who then ran in a northerly direction. Based on his testimony, the New York Police Department developed and distributed a sketch of the suspect in December 2016. However, it took into account that the person depicted in the sketch could have been a passerby who was in the wrong place at the wrong time. Unfortunately, the release of the sketch of the suspected perpetrator provided no new information, and the investigation reached another long stalemate. On December 4th, 2016, the Federal Bureau of Investigation joined the investigation into the death of Karina Vetrano. Initially, they developed a psychological profile of the perpetrator. According to FBI experts, the individual was very familiar with the area, especially the park where the incident occurred, suggesting the possibility that the assailant lived or continues to live nearby. However, fearing capture, he now avoids the area. It was clear he understood that the quiet, partially overgrown territory was ideal for concealing his act. Based on this theory, the police conducted screenings among local African American men, but this did not yield the desired result. Chanel Lewis's life didn't particularly stand out from other young African American individuals. He lived in one of Brooklyn's low-income housing complexes, about 4-5 miles from Spring Creek Park. Unemployed, Chanel lived with his mother, 3 sisters, and their children. Perhaps the only detail that set him apart was his diagnosis of paranoid schizophrenia. Nonetheless, this didn't prevent him from graduating from a private school for students with emotional and behavioral issues. Former classmates remembered Chanel as a quiet loner. The kids constantly picked on him, one of them shared. Girls even intimidated and punched him. He had no friends. Another peer mentioned that Lewis sometimes fought back, but not effectively. He was often ridiculed for his clothing and appearance. Chanel always wore a hoodie and would smirk and walk away in difficult situations, earning him the nickname African Lizard. However, a fellow student, 17-year-old Danielle Nunes, described Chanel as a smart kid with good grades. "He'd like to show me funny videos on the bus," she recalled. "I never saw him be cruel." Some sources reported that the young man once claimed he wanted to cut all the girls, asking during his time in middle school, "What happens if I bring a knife to school?" Dr. Edward Dana, the executive director of the school to which Chanel was transferred, commented on this. "We received no reports of threats in middle school. During his time at our school, he had no disciplinary sanctions. I never heard him make threatening statements towards other students." Nonetheless, Chanel was a traumatized teenager who often experienced bullying. He dreamed of working in social services, wanting to help those in distress. When conflicts arose at home, he would wander the streets, frequently visiting the park. Lewis had several minor encounters with the police, 2 for violations in Spring Creek and 1 for urinating in public. In May 2016, another incident occurred when a local merchant reported Lewis for loitering in his store with a crowbar. Responding officers checked Chanel's ID and released him, as he had no prior incidents. However, this information was retained by the police and would later play a crucial role in the investigation into Karina Vetrano's death. In February 2017, Detective John Russo, who was involved in the investigation, remembered something significant. He had repeatedly seen a young man in a hoodie wandering the park. John even attempted to follow him once, intrigued by the individual's behavior. The young man walked slowly, stopping for long periods in front of houses near the park as if scouting them for potential burglaries. However, Russo lost sight of him when he contacted his colleagues by phone. The next day, following a store owner's report, a teenager matching the description came to the police's attention. 2 months into the investigation, John Russo recalled this wanderer, thinking he might have seen or heard something relevant. Investigators zeroed in on Chanel Lewis after Detective Russo took a closer look at the young man's file. Chanel's peculiarities raised interest. The police began to inquire about him among acquaintances and teachers, and information surfaced that he had allegedly expressed a desire to harm girls. This news stirred concern and suspicion. With no other leads, officers decided to focus on Lewis. It was later discovered that during the time of Karina's death, Chanel was not at home. After an argument with his family, he had gone to the park. Upon his return, his appearance was disheveled, with torn clothing and visible bruises and abrasions. His mother inquired about what had happened, and Lewis claimed he had been attacked. His account matched the timeline with a witness's description of a man fleeing the park. Additionally, on August 3, 2016, Lewis's father, a former school principal, took him to the hospital for treatment of severe wounds, most of which were cuts, and he also had an injured hand. The investigators reviewed the medical records from that day and found the story plausible. However, they saw it differently, noting similarities between the events involving Chanel Lewis and Karina Vetrano. On February 4, 2017, Chanel was brought to the police station and voluntarily provided his DMA for analysis. Would a perpetrator willingly do this? Detectives wondered. The interrogation began on the morning of February 5th. Lewis admitted that he was indeed in the park around 5 p.m. on August 2, 2016, but clarified he was walking on dirt paths, not through the thickets, and listening to music. He confessed to encountering a young woman jogging with her phone in her hand. When asked by detectives if something happened when he encountered her, Chanel nodded and quietly said, "Yes." Everyone was stunned. His response was vague, indicating confusion. "I was angry. One thing led to another. What happened, happened," he finally stated clearly. Investigators were skeptical of this semi-admission, fearing it might provoke doubt among jurors during a trial. They waited for Chanel to elaborate. "I was walking in the park, trying to distract myself from a family argument. Then I met a woman. She was alone. I decided to follow her. When she passed by me, I grabbed her shoulders, threw her to the ground, and hit her face about 5 times so she couldn't scream. My punches knocked out several of her teeth, injuring my hand," Chanel recalled. He also added that the struggle lasted about 5 minutes. Miss Vetrano fiercely resisted, scratching and biting. To avoid attracting attention, Lewis dragged her from the path into tall grass, where he attempted to undress and assault her. She was shocked, but continued to resist. Chanel then forcefully strangled her until he realized she was no longer alive. When asked if he knew the victim beforehand, he replied, "I did not know her before this. It all happened by chance." The motive for the act became even more unexpected and bizarre. It turns out, loud music played by a neighborhood gang member for hours on end triggered Chanel's hatred and uncontrollable aggression. These negative emotions were unleashed on the unfortunate woman, a strange reason for an act indeed. Investigators' confusion was dispelled when DNA comparison results matched perfectly. Microscopic traces found on the victim's body and phone belonged to Chanel. Consequently, the police and the prosecutor concluded the case was solved and ready for court. However, the motive still seemed implausible. It's possible Chanel had noticed Karina before, as he often frequented the park and might have seen her with her father. He liked her and decided to approach her. But after being rejected, he became angry and struck her, and the situation spiraled out of control. This scenario would have been more understandable. On November 5, 2018, the trial against Chanel Lewis began. Despite his earlier statements to the authorities, Lewis pleaded not guilty, a stance echoed by his family, denying his involvement in the crime. The prosecution charged Lewis with ending a life and sexual assault, facing him with a sentence ranging from 25 years to life imprisonment. The debate over Lewis's guilt not only unfolded in the courtroom, but also spilled over into the media. Lewis's defense team stirred the pot, pointing out alleged legal violations during his arrest. Along with various news outlets, they claimed racial bias and discrimination. However, the judge dismissed these allegations as baseless, emphasizing that the investigation complied with legal standards. The prosecution presented tangible evidence and DNA analysis findings. The defense argued that the evidence was insufficient and contaminated, given the large number of people at the crime scene, including the victim's father who discovered her body. Forensic biologist Linda Razzano stated the odds of the DNA belonging to someone other than Lewis were 1 in 6 trillion. The prosecutor also introduced Lewis's phone records, revealing his internet searches on second chances and forgiveness in Catholicism, prompting the question, what sin was Chanel hoping to atone for? The release of Lewis's confession video sparked further controversy, with his lawyers arguing he was under immense pressure, leading to a coerced confession. They suspected the police of fabricating evidence, claiming the recording began only after Lewis was pressured, and that the search of his home violated protocols. The defense suggested the investigation into Karina Vetrano's death was initially botched, with public pressure mounting for an arrest leading to Lewis becoming a scapegoat. The jury was struck by the defense's powerful arguments. After hearing both sides, they were unable to reach a conclusive verdict. On November 21, 2018, the judge declared a mistrial, with a retrial initially scheduled for January 22, 2019, but later postponed to March 2019. After 5 hours of deliberation, Chanel Lewis was ultimately found guilty of Karina Vetrano's death and sentenced to life without parole on July 23, 2019. The defense's delay tactics included citing an anonymous source to allege misconduct by a juror, suggesting jury pressure and a conspiracy, with some calling the trial a lynch mob. The case, seemingly straightforward at first, ignited widespread prejudices and fears in society. Karina Vetrano's death touched many, serving as a grim reminder for women to be cautious. Did justice prevail? In any case, a young woman's life was cut short, and Chanel Lewis was sentenced to life imprisonment. Both families lost their children. The hope remains that the truth was indeed uncovered. Otherwise, an innocent man is behind bars while the perpetrator remains free. Fear is a negative and unpleasant feeling. Would anyone want to experience it over and over again? Cassandra and her twin brother Rob were the exception. As young children, they couldn't go a day without the scary stories they liked to tell each other in a room with the lights off. Rob was a natural storyteller, or at least he thought he was. Cassandra would scream at every story he told, and he, playing the brave though small man, would sprawl on his bed mumbling, "You can't even scare the neighbor's little Joey with stories like that. No, scary stories are not your thing." They also watched the animated series Scooby-Doo together, and while watching it, they argued over which of the characters in the story would turn out to be a ghost or a vampire in disguise. Cassandra's intuitive guesses were often ahead of her brother, and then he was nervous. Their mother, Mary Smith, although she did not share the passion of the twins, but to instill in her children a love of reading, bought them books by Robert Wall. Love for scary stories was not a childhood hobby, but a passion that brother and sister carried through life. They even collected figurines of villains, and as adults, seriously considered opening a themed store associated with this culture of horror. An interest in horror movies brought Cassandra to the set in 2004. She got a cameo in a scary movie that, although it didn't become popular, still caused a storm of envy in Rob, and he started asking his sister to make a deal for him. "You must have made some acquaintances there, right? I'm ready to play any one. Well, talk, CAs, please." "I'm pretty close with the head of the cast. Maybe something will come out of it, but no promises. I got the part by accident myself, after all." Cassandra replied. Roby was very happy, but to play, albeit in an episodic role, he was not able to. The head of the cast in that movie was Colin Dudley, and on the set between him and debuting actress flashed a spark. To make the first step, each of them did not dare. That all changed during a corporate Halloween party. Cassandra dressed up as Velma from Scooby-Doo, and Colin dressed up as Alex from A Clockwork Orange. And if for Cassandra, the image of the cartoon character was just an image, then, for Colin Dudley, it seemed, he was something more. He was walking with a glass of milk all evening, looking at everyone with a glare just as his character did in the movie, and also, he talked a lot of quotes from the book. For example, looking at Cassandra with delight, he said, "Beauty invariably caused my only desire to destroy it, for it did not fit at all into our ugly world." Cassandra thought it was a compliment, and they soon began dating, but their relationship didn't last long, only a couple months. Colin found another actress, Rebecca, and started dating her, and later on the couple started living together. August 25th, 2020. Cassandra Cantrell disappeared. She, without warning anyone, drove her car away from home in an unknown direction and did not answer phone calls. The police officers were very reluctant to take a report from her mother for a very long time, trying to calm the poor woman down and saying that sometimes children grow up and don't always warn their parents when they go out with friends. But Mary Smith was sure that something terrible had happened, and maybe if the lazy cops would finally start working, she would still have a chance to see her daughter alive. The search for Cassandra did not begin until 2 days later, and on the third day, the police found her car under a bridge, not in the most favorable area. Also, to add to the bad news, the car was unlocked, and the keys were inside. It was impossible to understand what Cassandra was doing here. This place was considered a neighborhood of homeless people, where with frequent frequency the police found their bodies, killed in a domestic fight, or died of an overdose of illegal drugs. The officers had to go around the neighborhood, questioning a lot of homeless people who, at the sight of the police, tried to get away for a while, but it was all to no avail. None of them had seen Cassandra, and none of them knew when the car showed up here. It was hard to expect anything else from the residents who lived under the bridge and drank alcohol all day long. The detective involved in the search for Cassandra had requested her cell phone billing, as he was instructed to do, but from experience he was sure it would get him nowhere. So it did. The signal showed that the phone was in the nearest body of water to the bridge, which meant that the detectives would not be able to recover it and get the information they needed. Nevertheless, a team of divers began searching the coastal area, and before they did so, standing on the shore, they picked up rocks from the ground and threw them into the water, testing how far they could throw the phone. Cassandra's mother said that her missing daughter's phone case was decorated with rhinestones, which meant it would not be difficult to find. Indeed, the phone was soon found, but Cassandra's body was not in the water. This was presented to her mother as good news, but the poor woman did not feel any better. She seemed to have gotten used to the idea that her daughter was dead, and the only thing she wanted was for her body to be found, and for this nightmare of uncertainty to end. "I was looking forward to my granddaughter. I wanted to be a grandmother sooner, and I didn't even have time to give her a crib. It's just sitting in the garage in a box. What should I do with it now?" Saddened the mother, and did not realize that this became important information for the investigation. According to statistics, a high percentage of crimes against pregnant women are committed by their partners, the fathers-to-be. But Mary Smith did not know who the father of her future granddaughter was. Cassandra, as it seemed to her, despite her already realized age, was not married and did not even meet anyone. It was understandable that she had gotten pregnant by a man, but Mary had no information about the potential father of the child. Although, again from the words of her mother, her daughter very often corresponded with someone and called, but the phone number of her interlocutor for some reason was not recorded in the daughter's book, and the mother, of course, did not remember the numbers. She just noticed that it is quite strange to communicate so often with a person and not write down his number. Girls, as it was known, could not keep their relationships in absolute secrecy, and there should be at least one friend with whom Cassandra shared her secrets, and especially if those secrets were related to pregnancy. And such a friend was found. In a conversation with police officers, she revealed that Cassandra had rekindled her relationship with her former boyfriend, Colin Dudley. Yes, their past relationship in 2004 was short-lived, and besides, it's been 15 years since their breakup. It is strange in general that after so much time they remembered each other. As it turned out, Colin himself came out to Cassandra, with whom he once worked on a movie set. In 2014, he found Cassandra on Facebook, wrote some warm words, and confessed that just recently his father died, with whom his wife, Rebecca, had a difficult relationship, and so he had no one to share his grief with. Cassandra, purely because of friendly motives, decided to meet and talk to the ex-boyfriend to calm him down, but the friendly meeting turned into something more. Since 2014, Colin began to live literally on two families, where Cassandra was in the status of mistress. When the young woman found out that she was pregnant, she did not want to inform Colin Dudley, because every time she wanted to admit it to him, she recalled their conversation where Colin said that he absolutely did not want children, and that he was very happy about Rebecca being infertile. The news that he might have a daughter or son could destroy a real family, and Cassandra didn't want to hurt her lover, so she kept the news a secret. Meanwhile, her belly was growing, and it was impossible to hide it under the oversized sweaters, and in order to Colin did not guess anything, Cassandra stopped seeing him. But how to move on? She couldn't hide it for long, and if she lied about having another boyfriend, it would hurt Colin and cause them to break up. Cassandra decided that the bitter truth was better than a sweet lie, so she told Colin over the phone that she was expecting a child with him. Colin was silent for a while, and then he finally said that he was delighted to hear the news. It sounded very strange, but Cassandra concluded that Colin was genuinely pleased. The detective arrived at Colin's house, knocked on the door, and his wife opened it. Deciding that it wasn't quite ethical to talk about a missing mistress in the presence of Colin's legal wife, the detective introduced himself as an old friend of Dudley's. Colin came out, immediately shut the door behind him, and walked away from the house with the detective, though the latter hadn't even introduced himself yet. It was as if he had been waiting for this meeting. "Thank you for not making your credentials public in front of Rebecca. You're a man of honor, a true officer. My compliments to you." Colin spoke in short sentences. "I heard Cassandra is missing. It's weird, bloody weird. I can't even guess where she might have gone. She told me she'd had a big fight with her brother and was really worried about it. I advised her to stop by and make up with him. I don't know if she listened to me or not." That Cassandra and Rob had been in a fight, the detective knew. Rob had told him about it himself. It was nothing serious, just a family misunderstanding, but nevertheless, Cassandra's twin brother had been very upset about it, because the day she disappeared, Cassandra had called him and wanted to come and talk to him, but his proud brother had refused, and now he blamed himself for it. If his sister had come to see him that day, she wouldn't have disappeared. "You know, officer, I'm not the nicest person. I think you realize that. Dating my ex-girlfriend in secret from my wife, and for such a long period of time, I'm sure I'll be punished for it in the next world. But the human heart doesn't decide who you fall in love with. In 2014, my father died. He literally hated Rebecca with all his soul, and the feeling was mutual. But he really liked Cassandra. He often remembered her, reproached me for the fact that we broke up with her almost immediately after Christmas. We often fight with our parents, accusing them of not understanding. And then it turns out that it's us, their children, who don't understand, and it hurts. My father was right, of course, and after he died, I just wanted to fulfill one of his wishes, and so I resumed my relationship with Cassandra. Rebecca needed to be broken up with. It was a conversation I kept putting off. You know, this family stuff sucks you dry, so I kept stalling. I've been living a double life for 5 years. It was hell. I had to make excuses for coming home late all the time. To hide it, I'd tell her about some fictitious business trips and even bought a fishing rod, even though I hated fishing, a stupid pastime. And I'd tell Rebecca I was going to the lake while I went to Cassandra's. Before coming home, I'd buy fish at the supermarket for extra convincing, and Rebecca would bake it in the oven and I'd eat it, even though the smell of fish makes me sick. Did you know Cassandra was pregnant? What? Pregnant? By whom? I don't have that information, but she told a close friend of hers that it was from you. That can't be true. She's been adamantly refusing to see me lately, and I guess I understand her and can't blame her for that. Naturally, she was tired of being in the background and wanted a family, which unfortunately I couldn't give her. I guess that the reason she refused to see me was because she had found someone else. When was the last time you saw her? Asked Detective Colin. Honestly, I can't even remember. I think it was about 3 months ago, maybe 4 if you don't count the time we literally ran into her at the mall by chance. But that was fleeting because my wife was in the fitting room, and I just got tired of waiting for her and decided to take a walk to the coffee shop. Tell me, officer, is there any chance you'll find her alive? Dudley asked one last time. We're doing everything we can. Believe me. This was not Colin's last encounter with the detective, even though Cassandra's phone, which was lifted from the bottom of the pond and could not be recovered, but the police requested the details of the calls of the missing person, and it turned out that most likely the unsigned number about which her mother told her belongs to Colin Dudley. Most often Cassandra called him, and even on the day of her disappearance, they called each other. In addition, on that day, the police received CCTV footage from the train station near the bridge, where Cassandra's abandoned car had been found, and on it they saw a strange man who stood out in the crowd of passengers on the platform. He wore a long cloak, gloves, his face was swathed in a scarf, and a hat was placed on his head, the sides of which covered his eyes. It was impossible to make out the face, but the detective said that the man's gait reminded him very much of Colin Dudley. As for the hat, it was almost identical to the one worn by Alex from A Clockwork Orange. After continuing to follow the strange man through the CCTV cameras, the detectives noticed that he literally went into the cafe for a few minutes, then came out of there and went towards the parking lot, where he got into his car and drove away. During all this time, the stranger never showed his face, but they could see the license plate number of the car in which the stranger got into, and the car belonged to Colin Dudley. A unit was sent to his house with a search warrant. The detectives had hoped that Cassandra was alive and in the basement at Dudley's house. At first, there was no evidence of a murder at Colin's house, but in the closet they found the very hat Colin was trying to cover himself with. They then went down to the basement, but Cassandra was not there, nor was there any evidence of the crime. However, the service dog, which was trained to search by the scent of blood, barked as it sniffed the couch, and that was already a very alarming bell. Colin assured that he had done nothing illegal, that the police simply had no evidence and no other suspects, so they were trying to pin the crime on him, an innocent man. The detective interviewed his wife, who of course was shocked at what was going on in their home, at the accusations against her husband, and at the fact that she had been deceived for years. Yes, she could say a lot of things about her husband and her emotions, but when the detective asked her if her husband was capable of murder, she, after thinking about it for a long time, answered in the negative. All the evidence that had been found against Colin wasn't enough to put him in jail, which made Rob and Mary Smith very angry, and the detective was just throwing up his hands. Colin was called in for questioning again. He thought carefully about the crime as he had an alibi for all the allegations. On the morning of August 25th at 6:30 a.m., Colin visited a hardware store where he purchased household cleaning chemicals as well as trash bags. And indeed, the store's cameras confirmed it, but the large trash bags overshadowed this situation. Colin then received a text message from Cassandra that she was almost at his house, but he immediately deleted the message, but it remained in the cell phone carrier's memory, and the police got it from the call and message dump. Also, according to their cell phone billing, the couple did not leave the house that morning for several hours. Colin then turned off his phone, but left his mistress's phone on, most likely by accident, and police saw the entire path of his movements, including where he was seen on the station's CCTV cameras. As the police already knew, after the cafe, where he was probably recovering from the murder by washing up in the toilet, Colin got into his car and drove to the pond where he had dumped Cassandra's phone, where the last signal from the cell phone had been received. It was now necessary to search for Cassandra's body. The police, in order to accurately track the route, seized a GPS tracker from Colin's car. The device completely replicated the movement of Cassandra's cell phone signal, but there was new evidence in the case based on his movements the next day. The cops retraced his path that went through the woods, and there in a ravine they spotted a huge trash can tied with ropes. All the ground around it was covered in blood, and it became clear what was in the container. Yeah, they were right. By then, it had been a month since the murder, and identifying the body was difficult. The police were helped by Cassandra's tattoo, which was described in the search notes. Colin was apprehended the same day and charged with murder. Forensics conducted a forensic examination and indicated that death was caused by a fractured skull due to blunt force trauma. During the examination of the basement of the Dudley house, the police found traces of blood, which could not be completely cleaned. Rebecca knew nothing about the murder. All day she spent in another part of the house, from which no noise in the basement cannot be heard, and she also confirmed that Colin never wanted children, and his story about her infertility, just a fiction. The police took this as a motive for the crime. During the trial, due to the lack of witnesses, physical evidence, such as the murder weapon, it was impossible to convince the jury that the murder was committed by Colin Dudley. Then, the court made a deal with the killer that if he pleaded guilty, he would get a lesser sentence. Colin was sentenced to 26 years in prison. Cassandra's mother and her brother, who still felt guilty that he had not agreed to meet with his sister before her death, were very upset, because the killer would most likely live to see the moment when he could go free.
In the spring of 2016, in the quiet town of Fort Worth, located in the state of Texas, there was a brutal and cynical murder that shocked even the most experienced investigators. The victim of the crime was a young mother of many children named Elizabeth Paula Arellano, who worked as a paramedic, and you will be shocked to learn who was her executioner. The circumstances of the tragedy were so strange that at first the police even put forward the theory that Elizabeth may have voluntarily passed away. However, such a theory did not fit with the testimony of people who became accidental witnesses of the terrible scene. The investigation had to do a lot of hard work to understand everything and send the criminal to the dock. However, given the brutality of the crime he committed, the sentence handed down seemed too lenient and unfair to many. Elizabeth Paula Arellano was born in 1987, August 16th, in the American city of Fort Worth, Texas, where she was destined to live all her short life. She grew up with her two sisters, Alessandra and Giovanna, with whom she was always practically inseparable. Elizabeth's birth father left the family when she was very young. He showed no interest in the fate of his daughter and did not contact her in any way. Soon her mother, Juanita, remarried to a man named Fidel, who adopted her children and treated them as his own. Elizabeth had a very warm relationship with her stepfather, who supported and helped her in everything. The girl studied diligently at school and dreamed of one day becoming a doctor. In high school, she met a guy named Rudolph Arellano, with whom she soon had a romantic relationship. The young man was almost 8 years older than her, which somewhat embarrassed Elizabeth's parents, but they did not interfere with their romance, because the chosen daughter seemed to them a man serious and quite reliable. At the age of 16 years, barely out of school, Elizabeth married her lover legally. The couple, one after another, had 4 children, 3 sons and a daughter. But despite the appearance of numerous heirs, Elizabeth did not intend to become a housewife. She remembered her childhood dream, so Elizabeth graduated from medical school and got a job as a paramedic, planning to get a higher education to become a doctor. The young woman was kind and pious, brought up in Christian traditions. She regularly took her children to church, instilling in them love and compassion for their neighbors. Family and friends characterized her as a very responsive person, always ready to help. From the outside, their marriage with Rudolph seemed strong and happy. But after 13 years of living together, this union began to literally crack at the seams. Rudolph had been jealous of his young wife before, trying to control her in everything, but over time his behavior became simply unbearable. In the spring of 2016, Elizabeth, after another jealousy scene organized by her husband, took the children and moved to the house of her parents. Rudolph made an attempt to reconcile with his wife, but the young woman was tired of tolerating his fits of anger. In addition, she did not want the children almost every day to listen to the parents' scandals, so she gathered her courage and officially filed for divorce. A few days after Elizabeth took the children and filed for divorce, she mysteriously disappeared. According to friends and family, she was in good spirits, and in order to distract herself from family problems and a little divorce, decided after work to go with colleagues to a local club. So, on Friday evening, April 15, 2016, the 28-year-old young mother in the company of her friends went to a fun place. There she danced and had a good time, but did not touch alcohol because she planned to get home in her own car, on which she arrived at the club. Elizabeth returned home well past midnight on April 16th. Having parked the car, she called her friend, with whom she had vacationed at the club that night, and told her that she had already reached home and that she was all right. Elizabeth then hung up the phone, but never entered the house. The next morning, her mother Juanita was very worried when she found her daughter was not home. She knew that Elizabeth was planning to spend the evening with friends, but her daughter should have returned long ago. She couldn't leave somewhere unannounced, and besides, her car was parked outside the house, which meant that Elizabeth had returned from the club. When Juanita approached the car, it turned out that it was not locked. The key was still sticking in the ignition, and inside on the seat were her daughter's purse and cell phone. Naturally, she couldn't leave her personal belongings in the open car like that, which meant that something terrible had happened. The woman immediately called the police, reporting a missing person. The police believed that they would be able to solve the case, as they call it, on hot tracks. In addition, there was still hope that Elizabeth was alive, because there was no blood or signs of struggle in the car. But it wasn't that simple. The first thing was to reconstruct in the smallest detail the chronology of the events of that evening and night, to trace Elizabeth's entire route, to find and question all possible witnesses. First, friends and colleagues of the young woman with whom she had spent the evening before her disappearance were interviewed. They gave the exact time when she went home, and later Elizabeth herself called back, saying that she had reached the place safely. In addition, several calls and messages from her ex-husband Rudolph Arellano, who had persistently tried to contact her that night, were found in the missing person's cell phone, but Elizabeth never answered him. Police officers went to Rudolph's house to find out where he was and what he was doing the previous evening and night. According to the man, he had been in contact with his ex-spouse just the night before, and she had promised that she would bring the children to him for the weekend. But afterward, she stopped answering the phone, and he thought she had changed her mind. As for an alibi, Arellano's alibi was questionable. According to him, he sat with a friend at a local bar that evening, and around midnight he returned to his home and went to bed. His friend and several other people who had been relaxing at the same establishment on Friday confirmed that Rudolph was indeed there, but where he went afterward, no one could say for sure. The man assured that he had gone home, but as he now lived alone, there was no one to confirm this. Thus, the police were not going to exclude Mr. Arellano from the list of suspects. Besides, he didn't seem upset or worried. It was clear that he and Elizabeth were in the process of divorce, but they had been married for many years. She was the mother of his children, and it was strange that her disappearance had not affected him in any way. On the night of the disappearance of a young mother, a fisherman called the emergency services to report a strange incident he had witnessed. The man said that he was sitting alone with a fishing rod on a bridge, which is part of an interstate highway, when about 4:30 in the morning, he noticed a car drive onto the bridge, stop, and then the driver pulled out something large that looked like a person and threw it into the water. It also appeared to him that something bulky and obviously heavy was tied to this person. Since the fisherman was at a great distance and it was still dark, he could not see details, nor could he see the make and number of the car. In addition, there was a strong wind on the bridge, so the man could not hear anything. Soon, another witness was found walking at night with his dog down by the bridge. He did not see what was happening on the bridge itself, but a heartbreaking scream caught his attention. Then he saw something large flying down from the bridge, followed by a splash and then silence. Based on the testimony of witnesses, the police decided to examine the bottom of the pond near the bridge. A few hours later, divers came across a body with a massive piece of concrete tied to its neck with a rope. The drowned woman turned out to be the missing Elizabeth Arellano. Had it not been for the testimony of a passerby and a fisherman, her body would probably have been discovered very soon or not found at all, because the tide weight did not allow the body to float. Then a version was put forward that the young woman decided to leave her life voluntarily against the background of problems in the family. But this assumption was untenable because it did not fit with the testimony of a witness who saw how someone threw her into the water, nor with the words of relatives, who assured that Elizabeth made great plans for life and would never do this to her children and parents. Elizabeth was still alive when a piece of concrete was tied to her neck and thrown off the bridge. This was evidenced by the forensic medical results, which showed that the young woman had suffocated, and by the testimony of a man who heard her desperate scream as she flew down the bridge. But who and for what reason could have so brutally massacred a mother of many children? Robbery was not considered because none of Elizabeth's belongings were taken. There were suggestions that the killer could have spotted Elizabeth in the club and then followed her home, or someone guarded her at home, waiting for her to return. The ex-husband of the deceased continued to insist that he was sleeping at his home on the night of the murder and had nothing to do with the crime. However, the investigators were still in no hurry to exclude Rudolph from the number of suspects because he had no alibi, and his behavior raised more and more questions. At the funeral, the man put on an act. He wept at the coffin of his ex-wife, saying that he would like to be in her place or die with her. According to his sister Elizabeth, she even believed in the sincerity of his words. In addition, Rudolph actively helped in the creation of a charitable foundation to raise funds for the ceremony of farewell to his wife. But after the funeral, when the man was once again called to testify, he already looked and behaved completely different, as if nothing bad had happened in his life. After a detailed examination of all the CCTV footage from the last route Elizabeth took, it was determined that a car of the same make and color as Rudolph's had driven away from her parents' house around 3 a.m. The neighbor also recalled seeing the car parked on the road near the deceased's house. Their neighbor also recalled seeing the car parked on the road not far from the deceased's house. Moreover, it was established that the car had subsequently driven towards the very bridge from which the woman had been thrown. This circumstance raised many questions, and when the investigation requested Rudolph's cell phone data on the night of the crime, the questions became even more. It turned out that the man made several calls that night, first near Elizabeth's place of work, and then near the home of his mother-in-law and father-in-law. He also sent his ex-wife several messages trying to find out when she would return, but his messages went unanswered. Apparently, he had been following her and eventually decided to wait for her return at Elizabeth's parents' house. The police finally had enough evidence to arrest Rudolph as the prime suspect and bring him to the station for further questioning. One of the key witnesses in the case was Elizabeth and Rudolph's eldest son. When the boy was shown the rope removed from his mother's neck, the son stated that he had seen it earlier in the backyard of his father's house and remembered it well because he had played with it. Moreover, the boy also recognized a piece of concrete that had been lying in their garden shortly before after the fence had been replaced. Also, small fragments of this concrete were found in the trunk of the car belonging to Rudolph. The investigation found that the man waited for his ex-wife at her parents' home and abducted her before she could enter the house. He forced her into his car, in the trunk of which he had already prepared rope and concrete. Afterward, he drove to the bridge for the massacre, expecting to go unnoticed. Rudolph Arellano was taken into custody 10 days after his ex-wife's body was recovered from the lake. Despite a large amount of evidence and witness testimony proving his guilt, Rudolph denied any involvement in the crime and continued to insist that he was at home that night. Given the brutality of his actions, Rudolph was facing the ultimate penalty of death. And then, on the advice of his lawyer, he decided to confess to everything and cooperate with the investigation to mitigate the sentence. It wasn't until January 2019 that Arellano pleaded guilty in court and detailed how he kidnapped and murdered his ex-wife and the mother of their 4 children. Juanita, who was in the courtroom listening to his story, fainted, and Alessandra and Giovanna called their sister's killer a monster. Rudolph himself, though he admitted his guilt, felt no remorse or pangs of conscience. He spoke indifferently and coldly about his murder, did not apologize, and did not explain the motive for his terrible act. The court sentenced the murderer to life in prison without parole. Elizabeth's family members, although they considered such a sentence rather mild, but noted that they forgive Rudolph because they do not want their hearts to boil with hatred. Her parents and sisters are now responsible for the upbringing of the deceased woman's children.
Australia is one of the most magical places on Earth. It's the smallest continent, a land of eternal summer with unique flora and fauna. Its very location is unique. Australia is the only country in the world that occupies an entire continent. Many people dream of this enchanting country, isolated from the rest of the world, as a place to chase their dreams. But in our story, one grand dream was not meant to come true. On March 5th, 2021, Jasmine Kaur finished her work shift and headed to the car park. A young man approached her and called her aside. Jasmine knew him, so she followed without fear. The next moment, he grabbed her by the neck with his strong hand and forcefully placed her in a nearby car. Jasmine resisted. She tried to scream and asked to be let go, but the choking pressure on her neck cut off her oxygen. She went limp, and the abductor placed her in the car. He hurriedly got behind the wheel and drove away. 18-year-old Jasmine came to Australia from India in pursuit of her dream. After her father's tragic death, she dreamed of becoming a nurse to help people. She wanted to obtain a quality medical education. With her mother's blessing, she joyfully accepted her aunt and uncle's offer to move to Australia. Thus, she settled in Adelaide with her close relatives and successfully enrolled in university. Studying was hard due to the heavy workload, but Jasmine was persistent and goal-oriented, never straying from her dream. She never missed a lecture, read mountains of textbooks, and helped her classmates with notes. Thanks to her perseverance, she earned the respect of her professors and became a role model for her peers. Jasmine Kaur's relentless determination not only allowed her to study, but also to find a job to gain practical experience. 2 years into her studies, Jasmine Kaur landed a student nurse position at the Southern Cross Homes Hospital in Plympton North, a suburb of Adelaide. At a university social event, Jasmine met Tarakjot Singh. The two quickly struck up a friendship. Both being from India, they had a lot in common to talk about. Tarakjot Singh came from an ordinary Indian family. After finishing school with flying colors, he aimed for a better education and moved to Australia to pursue a bachelor's degree in information technology. A kind and empathetic young man, he studied hard and worked to afford a comfortable living in the bustling city. The young people spent a lot of time together, hanging out at work and catching up at cafes between university lectures. Over time, their friendship blossomed into a romantic relationship. By April 2020, the young couple was no longer hiding their relationship and started planning a future together. Jasmine was smitten with Tarakjot's attention and care. He continuously expressed his devotion and love. Initially, it seemed like he was just very caring, but gradually his attentiveness became more intrusive. Tarakjot started inquiring about Jasmine's every move, justifying it by saying he was concerned for her well-being. Secretly, he began checking whom she was interacting with on social media, and then started demanding reports on her every step. Jasmine felt that Tarakjot's behavior had crossed all boundaries, but he managed to convince her every time that his total control was purely out of love and care. He would apologize and promise not to invade her personal space without reason, but these were just empty promises. Over time, Jasmine felt increasingly suffocated in her relationship with Tarakjot. He strongly opposed her interactions with family and friends. This isolation deeply hurt her, leading Jasmine to make a crucial decision to end the relationship and free herself from the pressure. With her family's support, Jasmine informed Tarak Jat that she was ending their relationship. He reacted with fury, screaming, cursing, and threatening retribution against her family. Jasmine was emotionally drained. She took leave and went to stay with her mother in India. But even there, Tarak Jat did not leave her alone. From afar, he used emotional blackmail, threatening to end his life. Tarak Jat took drastic measures to capture his ex-girlfriend's attention. At one point, he attempted to end his life by consuming several packs of sleeping pills, recording the act and sending the video to Jasmine, hoping to elicit pity and compassion. However, his plan backfired, and instead of winning her back, he ended up in the hospital under medical care. After receiving the necessary therapy, Tarak Jat returned to his job and studies. It appeared he had accepted the breakup with Jasmine and started a new life without her. But on March 6, 2021, Jasmine Kaur did not show up for work. As evening fell and darkness enveloped the streets, a car swiftly made its way through the city, adeptly avoiding surveillance cameras. After an hour's drive, the car came to a stop. The young man exited and helped the girl out. She was weak from the prolonged lack of oxygen. With cold efficiency, he retrieved tape and a cable from the trunk. Without a word, and with brute cruelty, he sealed her mouth and eyes with the tape, causing her eyelashes to stick together and pulling tightly on the delicate skin of her face. Then, the man tied her hands behind her back. She writhed in fear. Silence. There was nowhere to run. He pushed her, and when she fell, he tied her legs with the same cable. The victim moaned and squirmed on the dusty road. Her long, dark hair tangled, and her clothes became dirty. After binding her legs, he grabbed her hair and with a swift slash cut across her throat. The victim went silent. He placed the knife in a bag and carelessly lifted the immobilized girl off the ground into the trunk. Closing the lid, he lit a cigarette. He took a few puffs before getting back into the car to continue his drive. He drove through the evening and all night. Only in the early morning did his car stop at Death's Peak. The man dug a shallow grave, removed the victim from the trunk, and laid her in the ground. Thus, the young woman was buried alive by her abductor. But she was still alive. Her eyes didn't see the horror of her situation. Lying in the cold earth, trying to breathe, her nostrils filled with fine sand, the weight of the soil pressing down on her, she was unable to move. Fear and the realization of complete helplessness took over her mind. She could only moan, briefly, then she fell asleep, forever. So easily and simply, one person decided they had the right to determine another's fate. But evil must and will be punished. On March 6, 2021, Jasmine Kaur did not show up for work at the Southern Cross Care elderly home in North Plimpton, where she worked as a nurse without any prior warning. Her supervisor contacted her family. On the same day, she was declared missing. A search began. Surveillance footage from that evening was reviewed, but there was nothing that could aid the investigation in finding Jasmine Kaur. The last time the young nursing student was seen was leaving her job at Southern Cross Homes in Plimpton North around 10 p.m. on March 5th. Tarak Jat Singh quickly became the prime suspect with a motive, especially since Jasmine had filed a harassment complaint against him with the police just weeks before her disappearance. When first questioned by police on March 6th, Singh claimed he couldn't remember the last time he saw Jasmine Kaur and insisted he was at home on the night of her death. The following day, Singh informed the officers that Jasmine had taken her own life and that he had buried her in the Flinders Ranges. He led the police to the burial site, where they discovered Jasmine's shoes, glasses, and work ID badge in a trash bin, along with zip ties. She was exhumed 2 days after Tarak Jat Singh was interrogated by the police at Morialta Creek, 40 kilometers north of Hawker, approximately 100 meters from the road and nearly a 5-hour drive from the location he allegedly took her. Tarak Jat Singh was arrested and held in custody pending trial. Investigators determined that in the days leading up to her disappearance, Tarak Jat Singh had meticulously prepared for the abduction and death of the young woman. It was found that on the day of the kidnapping, Singh had purchased zip ties tape, and rope from a hardware store. Searches conducted at the residence where Karek Jot lived uncovered several SIM cards and phones, proving that he had carefully planned the abduction, even going as far as changing his SIM card to fabricate an alibi. On the night of the abduction, Singh switched cars with his apartment neighbor and asked him to cover his shift, then headed to the elderly home where Jasmine was working that day. Initially, Singh was charged with failing to report a death to the coroner before the charge was upgraded to homicide. Following the investigation, 21-year-old Tarak Jat Singh from Karalta Park was charged with the homicide of 21-year-old Jasmine Kaur after her body was found buried at Morialta Creek. Singh first appeared via video link before the Port Augusta Magistrates Court on March 9th, where Judge Gregory Fisher ordered the accused's name and face to be withheld for 30 days. In July 2021, hearings in the Jasmine Court case began under Judge Adam Kimber in the Supreme Court. It emerged during the hearings that Singh was in Australia on a student visa and had spent time in a short-term psychiatric ward that year. Prosecutors told the Supreme Court that 21-year-old Jasmine Kaur was assassinated a month after she reported her ex-partner Karek Jat Singh for stalking her. Singh pleaded guilty to the of Jasmine Kaur in March 2021, and the details of his crime were outlined during the sentencing. Prosecutor Carmen Mateo stated that Jasmine Kaur endured absolute terror after Singh abducted her from her workplace in Adelaide on March 5, 2021. The court heard Jasmine Kaur suffered an extraordinary level of cruelty after her former boyfriend kidnapped her, bound her with tape and zip ties, and buried her alive with her eyes bound and conscious at Death's Peak, near Hawker in the Flinders Ranges. Evidence provided by the pathologist who conducted Jasmine's autopsy indicated that Singh made superficial cuts to her throat, but these did not cause her death. An autopsy report presented showed Jasmine Kaur died on March 6, 2021, several hours after being buried. Horrific details emerged during the sentencing at the Supreme Court. Prosecutor Carmen Mateo stated she had to be acutely aware of her hopeless situation, and she must have consciously suffered from what can only be described as absolute terror. Mateo also mentioned that the act was inefficient, and Jasmine Kaur was made to suffer. It is unknown when her throat was cut, unknown when and how she ended up in that grave or was placed there, and unknown when she was dug out, other than the accusation suggests that it must have happened while she was still alive and being prepared for burial. During the initial investigation into Jasmine Kaur's death, Tarak Jat denied any wrongdoing, continuously asserting that she took her own life. However, Judge Adam Kimber stated that Singh prepared a series of calculated steps over a certain period of time to commit the crime. Prosecutor Carmen Mateo informed the court that Miss Kaur had filed a police report claiming that Tarak Jat Singh was stalking her on February 9th, about a month before she was assassinated. She said that Singh began cold and clinical planning of Miss Kaur's death after their relationship ended. The manner in which Jasmine Kaur was murdered indeed involved an extraordinary level of cruelty, she added. Martin Anders, the attorney representing Singh's interests, stated that 2 months before the tragic incident, the Singh and Kaur families had a meeting that resulted in a negative decision regarding the continuation of their relationship. He also mentioned that Singh's reasoning was seriously impaired following the end of their relationship. This is not someone who was really well-grounded in terms of understanding what desires were at play, how these issues evolved, and how he might have properly reasoned in the circumstances he faced. The lawyer explained, he took actions that destroyed not only her life, but his own. Martin Anders commented on Singh's deteriorating mental health and his experiencing hallucinations following Jasmine Kaur's demise. However, a psychiatric evaluation concluded that Tarak Jat Singh was fully sane at the time, and he was charged with assassination. During the sentencing, the court heard about several messages Singh wrote but never sent to Jasmine in the days leading up to her death. These messages contained statements such as, "Your bad luck that I'm still alive, just wait and see. Every one of them will get an answer, and deep inside what I feel but can't overcome." The prosecution informed the court that Singh downloaded a map of surveillance cameras across Adelaide the day before abducting Jasmine. Miss Mateo said that surveillance footage showed Singh purchasing zip ties from a hardware store on the afternoon of the abduction. She also mentioned that Singh removed the SIM card from his phone, placed it in another device, and left it at his home to engage cell towers that would create the impression he was at or near his home. He punished her, a defenseless, innocent girl, for rejecting him, she said. According to the prosecution, he forced her into the car, kept her on the back seat or in the trunk, took her a significant distance, ended her life, buried her, and disposed of any evidence that could implicate him in this crime. Judge Kimber sentenced him to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. His lawyer described the act as a crime of passion and appealed for a more lenient sentence, but the request was denied. Relatives of Jasmine, who was buried alive, were present during the sentencing. In her statement, Jasmine's mother welcomed the verdict. "Today I don't feel happy. I wish I wasn't making this statement and that Jasmine was still here with me," she said. Rashpal Kaur told the court she is haunted by the thought of what her daughter Jasmine Kaur experienced in her final moments. "I go through the terrible sequence of events, wondering when she realized she was in mortal danger," the statement read. "There was no one to save her. She spent her last hour on this earth with the worst of humanity. Jasmine is gone, and I am devastated with grief. She was a precious little girl." Rashpal Kaur stated that Singh was obsessed with Jasmine, who had rejected him 100 times. "She lost her life because Tarak Jat wanted to force her into marriage and force her into a relationship with him," she said. Mrs. Kaur stated she would never forgive Singh for what he had done. "Justice has prevailed, and I cannot express our relief. We welcome the sentence, but what I can say is that my family and I have already begun serving a life sentence, and we will have to spend the rest of our lives without Jasmine." Jasmine's employer and those she cared for described her as a beautiful soul who was kind, sweet, and attentive. Thus, 21-year-old Indian student Tarak Jat Singh, who abducted his former girlfriend, 21-year-old Jasmine Kaur, from a South Australian nursing home where she worked in North Plympton, Adelaide, in March 2021, was sentenced to life in prison for a term of no less than 23 years without the possibility of parole. He bound her with tape and zip ties and then buried her while she was still conscious at Death's Peak near Hawker in the Flinders Ranges. Singh, who was 20 at the time, initially pleaded not guilty to the crime against Miss Kaur, but changed his plea a month before the trial in the Supreme Court. Judge Adam Kimber ordered Singh to serve a sentence of 22 years and 10 months without the possibility of parole, just slightly more than the mandatory minimum term for ending someone's life in South Australia, which is 20 years. While rendering the verdict, Judge Adam Kimber described the crime as horrific and extremely heartless, stating he was at a loss for words to describe the terror of Miss Jasmine Kaur's final moments. "The terror she must have felt when she was abducted, tied up, and held in the car during the long drive to Morallen Creek is hard to fathom," said Judge Kimber. "I cannot describe the horror that Miss Kaur must have felt when she realized that you were burying her alive." The court heard that Singh did not reveal details about how he abducted Miss Kaur from her workplace or what he did with her in the subsequent hours. However, Judge Kimber stated there was clear evidence that she suffered greatly and was forced to endure a long car ride while bound and gagged. After the sentence was announced, Judge Adam Kimber said it was clear that the crime was premeditated and that Singh took steps to conceal his horrific actions. "The enormity of what you did must have been clear to you," said the judge. "There was time to reflect. There was time to step back from the plan. Yet you proceeded and ended Miss Kaur's life." Judge Adam Kimber told Singh that he was beyond any reasonable doubt satisfied that the criminal was only concerned about himself. "You ended Miss Kaur's life to punish her for her unwillingness to maintain a relationship with you and for turning to the police," he stated. The police had warned Singh about stalking in early February 2021, less than a month before the crime. During the sentencing, The court heard that Singh wrote several messages to Miss Kaur in the days before her death, which were never sent. At the trial, a statement Jasmine Kaur wrote to the police just 5 weeks before her death was read, detailing how her overly possessive perpetrator persistently followed her in the street and at her workplace. In the statement, signed January 28, 2021, Miss Kaur disclosed that she had been in a controlling relationship with Singh for about 9 months. He was overly possessive and wanted to control who I spent time with, the document released by the Supreme Court stated. Miss Kaur told the police that she ended the relationship on January 4, 2021, but Singh took it badly. He stated that I had to be with him, or else he would try to end his own life, she said. During their relationship, she mentioned Singh would sometimes get upset if she planned to go out with friends, calling her and demanding she come home. Singh, a citizen of India who came to Australia to study information technology at a university and who also worked at a nursing home, is likely to be deported once he is released from prison. Tarakjot Singh will be about 40 years old when he becomes eligible to apply for parole in January 2044. Jasmine Kaur became yet another victim of terror from a man, the attentive, sensitive, and kind. Tarakjot Singh, whom she loved and trusted, turned out to be a wolf in sheep's clothing, and his pathological jealousy and emotional instability cost her her life. A person who truly loves can never harm their beloved. They would take any blow upon themselves. In the case of Tarakjot, there is no right answer. Some may see in this story an insult, some incompetence, and others might consider the guy a psychopath. But looking at Jasmine's story, one can learn, at the cost of her mistakes, to prevent themselves and their loved ones from making similar ones in the future. Jasmine Kaur's case is a heart-wrenching story of toxic obsession and crime that shook the Australian backcountry, following the disastrous end triggered by the boyfriend's reprehensible behavior.